All right, AP Gov. So this is an important lecture with 6 not so simple concepts that you're going to have to know backwards and forwards. This is one of these things that you are almost 99.9% sure you're going to see on one of the FRQs on the exam. You see it on my test, and obviously you need to be able to form arguments about these principles that are found in our Constitution. The further we get in the class, the more you're going to learn about these. So this is kind of a big overview. Know the definitions, know the basics, start thinking about them. And then as we go through the course, you'll see, actually as you go through life, you'll see like, oh, there's a current event today. That reminds me of one of the principles in our Constitution. So I say on here in the title slide, these principles are woven into the U.S. Constitution. This is a metaphor, of course. All right, so here's the definitions of the 6. You should know these already from chapter 1 in your AMSCO book. Popular sovereignty. This is our government governs with consent of the people. Okay, this is sort of that the idea of the social contract, right? All of these, by the way, our founding fathers didn't invent these. They totally ripped them off and plagiarized them from our Enlightenment thinkers. That you need to have some of those in your brain too. Montesquieu, Hobbes, Rousseau, and some of the basic ideas that those guys brought into the writing of our Constitution. So popular sovereignty, we've got that one. Limited government, this is basically simple idea. It is what it is. The government is not all powerful. They must act within the law. All throughout the Constitution, you're going to see powers that are granted to the federal government. There's references to things that state governments will be allowed to do. And all of these really are just putting limits on our government. Separation of powers, that's your 3 branches. And number 4, kids kind of confuse these, so make sure you use the terminology right. Checks and balances. Checking and balancing the power is something that happens to our 3 branches. So the legislative branch has powers that they can use to check the power of the presidency of the executive branch, or the judicial branch can check laws made by the legislative. So we separate the powers into 3 branches. They all have different roles, and why we do that is another principle. Helps provide checks and balances. Rule of law, nobody is above the law. Not the president, not the richest guy in the country, all of that. Everyone must follow laws. Equality under the eyes of the law. And then federalism, this one is huge. We're going to talk about this. This is actually all of chapter 2 is all about federalism. So big overview, division, levels of power between national, also federal, we say usually the same terminology, national and federal, and then state and local government. So you have national at the top, state and local, and powers are granted within to all of these levels. So let's look a little more in depth. Going back to popular sovereignty, again, people are the only source of government power. The biggest thing, I'm just doing this with pictures because it's simple, put them in your brain, the vote. This is one of the most, it's not the only, but it's the most common way we know that the people have the power. There's another picture there, some posters for a recall election, if you remember that from your progressive era reforms. We can vote people in, we can vote people out, we can vote for ideas, things like ballot initiatives, referendums. All of these are the ways, various examples for popular sovereignty. And again, throughout the class, you're going to just hear more and more of these. The next one, limited government. This is really based on the idea, really all of our Enlightenment thinkers believe this. Of course, our founding fathers believe this. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Each aspect of government controls of your life is one less aspect of control of your own life. And as we remember, we don't like the monarchies, we don't like the dictatorships. So there's lots of things woven into our Constitution that are going to limit our government. Some are obvious. President has no right to get rid of habeas corpus. Some things are more vague. When we get to talking about things like the 9th and 10th Amendment, we'll see some more of those. Here we have the system of checks and balances. You're going to see little graphics like this in your book and all over the place. When we get into the details of how each branch checks and balances each other, you're going to learn a ton of these. I kind of put two of our principles on this slide. So each branch of government checks and balances out the power of another. That's one principle, one idea. The system is provided by separating the powers. So we do have those 3 branches and different roles. If you look on this slide, some of these you probably know. If Congress passes a law, the president either has to sign off on it or veto it. The judicial branch, the Supreme Court of the United States, for example, can look at a law and say that law is unconstitutional, like obviously the most well-known are the segregation laws. In the 1950s and 60s, the Supreme Court overturned a lot of those things. There's other things in here. If you look at the arrows, they're going all over the place because that's the whole point of checks and balances. Things like appointments of cabinet officials. The president gets to do that. Various roles within the government, but a lot of those have to go through the Senate. Not all of them, but a lot of those require that. Obviously, we have to have approval of who becomes Supreme Courts, even though the president gets to pick that. Power to declare war, yada yada. Again, we're going to learn a ton of these things, but at a basic level, checks and balances, one of the ways we do that is to separate the powers. The rule of law, what a great topical political cartoon there. Again, the idea that nobody is above the law. So we have 4 little enhancements there to the basic idea. Equality under the law, transparency of law. There's lots of things in our government, laws directed to our government to basically be transparent so we know what's happening. Independent judiciary, accessible legal remedies. Obviously, we have court systems and things like that to root out when people aren't following the law, be it politicians or regular citizens. We have that. Who's that guy there with Donald Trump chipping away at the rule of law? Well, that was the first president where people started to get worried. Nixon, with the big old nose. And now, of course, we've got Nixon times 100. So we have Donald Trump there. The last one, again, super important, chapter 2, federalism. Now, federalism is kind of another way that the founding fathers wanted to check and balance the power of our government. But this time it's not branches. It's not legislative, executive, judicial. It's levels, federal, state, and local. Got some quotes there from our Federalist Papers. Neither of those are ones you have to know. But why our framers liked it, they got a problem with unlimited power. So this is another good way to do it. You'll see this type of Venn in your book in lots of places. And again, as we get into the chapter in chapter 2, we'll get into way more detail. But in the blue part of the Venn, you see powers delegated to the national or to the federal government. Some of these you're probably familiar with. Power to declare war. No, North Carolina can't go to war with somebody. They haven't been given that power in the Constitution. Foreign policy stuff. Again, states can't do that. Copyright, patent laws, post offices, making money, interstate trade, and foreign trade. These are things, all that only the federal government can do. In the red part, powers reserved to the states, establish local governments. Local governments, cities and counties, technically municipalities, which are like cities and towns, and counties, they derive all their power from the state governments. So that's one of the powers of the states. Create the local governments. They do this through charters and things you will hopefully do a lot more work on in your civics class. Maintain schools, regulate trade within the states, conduct elections, provide for public safety. A whole bunch of stuff falls under that. You can imagine, with speed limits and things like that. In the center of the Venn, these are powers that are called concurrent or shared. Raising taxes, you're going to get taxes at all levels. You pay your income tax to the federal government, pay an income tax to the state government, pay a sales tax to the states, sometimes to local cities, all of that. Provide for the public welfare. This is pretty vague. So a lot of things might be able to fall under that we'll learn about. Criminal justice, obviously you have federal courts, you have state courts, all of that. Borrowing money, chartering banks, building roads, a lot of these are all, again, concurrent or shared powers. So you're going to learn tons more of these when we get into chapter 2. But federalism is big, and something to keep in mind, because I think you see it in chapter 1, you will see it in chapter 2. In Article 1, Section 8, Article 1 is directed powers to the legislative branch. Section 8 is what they call the necessary and proper clause, or sometimes the nickname is the elastic clause. And basically what that is a very vague statement that says Congress has the power to create laws necessary and proper, I'm paraphrasing, to run the nation. Well, what does this mean in practice? It gives them a lot of power, right? So it's elastic. It says Congress can take this one little section in the Constitution and it gives them really broad powers to do a lot of things. Also, the 10th Amendment, when you think of federalism as well, because that says that all powers not enumerated, meaning listed specifically to the federal government, are reserved to the states. That terminology is in the 10th Amendment. We get to the Bill of Rights, we'll study more about that. And also just of note, over the past 224 years, SCOTUS has been drawing the line between state and federal power. That's their Supreme Court. There's lots of conflicts that happen. They make it all the way to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court decides who's right and who's wrong. Probably from history, you remember Gibbons versus Ogden, the two steamboat operators that had the conflict between the state license and the federal license. That goes to SCOTUS. They decide, right? And they decide that for interstate licenses, federal government has power. There's a whole bunch of these. When we get to the civil rights era, you'll see a lot of these too. This is how the federal government is going to be able to integrate a lot of things in the states, is because we're going to start reinterpreting a lot of parts of the Constitution. You're going to see these in both multiple choice, the concepts. You're going to see these concepts in both multiple choice and your free response. Here's just an example. Now, I don't have the actual multiple choice question here, but you might get a multiple choice question that gives you this information, and then you have to say which principle is related to this. So this is just saying voters without a government-issued photo ID. All voters, approximately 1 in 10 Americans, don't have a government-issued photo ID, which could be used in some states to require people to vote. African American voters, approximately 1 in 4, don't have a government-issued photo ID. So if you think about your 6 principles and you say, now I have this information, which principle does this seem like we're not living up to here? Voting is a clue, right? So probably popular sovereignty, the idea that we all have a say in our government. Well, if you have photo ID laws on that disaffect certain groups of people, disenfranchise certain groups of people, you'd have a problem. So that might be a way you'd see a multiple choice question asking you. As far as the FRQ, their free response question, this is a sample of one from a released exam. Again, they give you some data here. Public education spending, amount spent per pupil. This is data from 2014. So you'd have to analyze this, and then these free response questions, this particular style is going to have the ABC. So A just says identify the most common level of education spending. Identify is easy. You just say this is what the chart says. But if you look down into C, it says explain how public education spending, as shown in the information graphic, demonstrates the principle of federalism. So you basically would have to write about this, and you'd have to say, how is federalism, the idea that we divide powers between federal, state, and local, how is the data in this chart demonstrating this to me? You would want to bring up the fact that education spending is primarily a state issue, and then you could kind of go from there. So anyways, these are some ways you're going to see this there. So I'm going to go back to the slide. Do you have them memorized? Popular sovereignty, limited government, separation of powers, checks and balances, rule of law, and federalism. Live it, love it, learn it. Learn more about it. It's never going away. See you soon.